All right, folks, I hope you had a good break. We're going to go ahead and get started with the next panel discussion. So go ahead and take your seats, and just I'll go over just a couple of quick reminders as we did before the previous talk. It's pretty noisy out here, as you saw with the adjacent meeting, so if you do have to talk, just step away from the building. Bathrooms, I hope you found them by now. If not, we might be in trouble. But there are some on this floor as well as the floor below. And then I'll just remind you of this again at the end. We'll save questions after each presenter to the end of the session, and do use the microphones at the side of the room. We'll have two folks that will help bring the microphone out into the audience as well. People in the back of the room are having some trouble hearing without amplification, and of course you won't be recorded for posterity if you don't speak into the microphone. So, welcome again, everyone. I'm Martha Baum. I'm an assistant professor here in the department, and I'm one of the team members on the grant working with NYSERDA. And I'll be moderating the talk that's looking at some professional perspectives on resilience. Now, in the first session, we really dug pretty deeply into buildings, and specifically in New York State. But in this session, we're going to be looking laterally. So we're going to look at a number of professionals within the building realm which work on the questions of resilience, and each work in different ways. So, we're going to see in the next three speakers some variations on problem framing, on conceptual orientation, on definitions of key terms, on scale and scope of work, strategies, and so on. So we'll be presented with a plurality of approaches. And the task of this session is really to look at how do we think across disciplines to wrestle with this grand challenge that's facing the building professions of a changing climate. So we'll be getting into some of that with the discussion that we have at the end. And really looking to mine those differences for new ways of working, new ways of thinking. So I would like to introduce the first of our three speakers, and you'll note from the introductions that each of them represents a different disciplinary background. The first speaker will be Rosetta Elkin, who's an assistant professor of landscape architecture at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. She's co-director of the Master of Design Studies in Risk and Resilience program, and serves as an associate at Harvard's Arnold Arboretum. So her teaching and scholarship focuses on an expanded role for specifying plants as a living medium, to some of the questions earlier today, from the role of seed mechanics to the behavior of species at supercontinental scales. Her current research projects include an ongoing collaboration with the Army Corps of Engineers on living shorelines, South Florida and sea level with the GSD's Office for Urbanization, and SCR, Structures for Coastal Resilience, with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation. So we'll see some of that work in the presentation today. As a licensed landscape architect in the Netherlands, she's been practicing internationally, while her publications and exhibitions have been funded broadly, including from the Grand Foundation for the Arts, Fonds BKVB, and the Canada Council for the Arts. So Rosetta, please join me in welcoming her to the speaker's podium.
Thank you, Martha. Can you all hear? It's a little bit low, so I can't tell because we're very close, but hopefully, okay. So what underscores my presentation today? Now wait, I'll just go right ahead. Synthesizes around the serious uncertainty coming from the sciences, and in turn our formal certainty as designers. This quote is a particularly poignant example. Projections of future climates and ecology, like the retreat of mountain glaciers and the polar ice caps, the migration of forests, and so on, are really just proposals made in spite of real ignorance about the critical physical and biological processes involved and the difficulty of actually evaluating them. What David Bierling suggests is that the changes we are experiencing in the living and built environment are so dynamic that they resist scientific objectification, big data, and analysis that arrest processes in order to freeze them, study, and forecast. As predictions fail, the only thing that seems most certain is that things are changing. The question this symposium asks, and one that ought to be more evenly deliberated in the design professions, is how do we want things to change? Because climate projections are really just proposals. In this way, if scientists are making recommendations, then as designers, we might be empowered to generate predictions. So I would like to cover a particular area of resilience that is implicit to each of the projections and theories that we heard this morning. And I would propose that stability is not a feature of resilience, and that disturbance can be a powerful design parameter. So resilience tends to be juxtaposed against disturbance and low stability. It does not evoke volatile states or non-equilibrium. Instead, it has come to suggest a kind of inherent stability or toughness. When we think of resilience in 2016, we think of strength, perhaps nowhere captured more clearly than in this title of New York City's post-Sandy reconstruction plan, A Stronger, More Resilient New York. So first, I will describe the lineage of the term resilience before it was impressed upon our funding streams, and then I will describe a project that uses plant dynamics as the raw matter of a more endorsable model of resilience, taking the attention away from uncertainty, the uncertainty of fixed solutions and climate forecasting, and instead offering low stability as a predictive and known attribute of resilience. So the term resilience has come to define all post-disaster recovery, coastal protection measures, and rebuild procedures. And while I'm convinced by the necessity of the term, I'm anxious about its rise in popularity. The word did not enter contemporary usage until well after its first acceptance into ecology in 1973. It was cleverly appropriated from its application, actually, to elasticity gradients in material science by the prominent C.S. Halling, Buzz Halling, in order to help him explain complex system dynamics in ecology. In appropriating the term from material sciences into ecology, Halling applied it suggestively to time, not space, using evidence collected through observation of behavior, amplitude, frequency of oscillations, etc. The opening line is very striking. He writes, "Individuals die, populations disappear, and species become extinct." Temporal transformation is common to all biota. It is a crucial part of ecological frameworks, from development through formation. For Halling, the term was implicitly related to duration because of elasticity gradients. So he could justify the idea of intervals in ecology, so critical to recovery. Halling proposed that when considering the performance of systems, attention ought to emphasize timescales that allow organisms to persist rather than targeting momentary equilibrium states, a popular notion of ecology which overlooks dynamic values such as, frankly, disturbance, decay, and death, which are essential parts of ecology. Therefore, the amount of impact from a disturbance on the micro-relationships of organisms, both plant and animal in this case, could either result in the absorbance of a shock or in an alternative configuration. Prior to this suggestion, single equilibrium states had dominated ecology. Climax ecology, it was called. Halling's multi-stable state reality, as he called it, revealed instability as a predictable outcome, an important attribute of behavior in all ecological systems. Resilience defined this novel form of instability, one that was predicated on high variability and behavior expressed far from equilibrium. Time became a generative feature of ecological theory as Halling ascertained that the most resilient systems are simultaneously those that display low stability. He substantiated this claim with a description of spruce budworm, which is an infestation of spruce trees. Mature or old-growth forests were ecologically very stable, what you would call a climax forest, and it would not return once the disaster of the spruce budworm attacked it. It was the younger forests, those that were temporally extreme, that persisted far from stability, who were deemed resilient because they could regenerate or were resilient to budworm. Thus, the predictable behavior of low stability enables resilient behavior. The power of low stability in this lineage has been overlooked in resilience planning now that it has been further appropriated into the built environment. While the range of disturbances are similarly ecological in scale, it's light, but that's the range of Sandy, our response is projecting stable states. In the case I will describe today, with fortified and urbanized coastlines. In landscapes whose soils are imported, drained, filled, and altered for human gain, why not imagine another form of rebuild, a low stable state embedded in a different land use policy in order to further our collective cultural and social values? If disturbance can become a catalyst for designing and rebuilding, if disturbance can become a catalyst for designing, then rebuilding develops as a process of regeneration, not a construction detail. This is a closer look at the active coastal reconstruction projects in the North Atlantic Division of the Army Corps of Engineers, confirming the coast as a built environment. This conference, and certainly others like it, are positing that the design fields must conform to new standards to increase frequency, to crisis perhaps as a condition. But in order to do so, we must reinvent our methods, tools, tastes, if we are expected to respond with more informed outcomes. So we must collectively recognize in all our disciplines that repeating the same operations will not in fact yield higher forms of resilience. Even when extractive and built paradigms degrade the land, like building a community in a salt marsh, we further exploit this scenario with the assumption that we can plant over the mess and make it look the same after a natural disturbance, perhaps diminished in scale and certainly in function. But at least we can plant back the species we took away or those that were displaced. We have to put everything back just as it was to cover our tracks, if you will, so that no one could tell what had happened there. So restoration, you could say, is the exact opposite as an alternative configuration. This counteracts the uncertain regional manifestations of climate change with alleged certainty in the built environment. We are certain to restore. Yet the alternative configuration, in this case, Phragmites, which probably in my field would get a bit of a boo in the audience, is perhaps less attractive, and certainly even unstable, but is in fact more resilient. We have engineered the hydrologic flow, the biotic movement, and the morphological features to such an extent that there is no return because the attraction of known states and high stable and predictable outcomes is only now a feature of resilience. Let me give you a more visceral and less planted example. This is the urbanized coast. Fixed form meets ecological transformation post-Sandy. If high resilience can only be achieved through the modifications embedded in low stability, and if the outcomes often reveal new configurations, then renovating a seawall, restoring a salt marsh, or renourishing a dune are the lowest possible forms of resilience building, and the highest form, frankly, of securing failure. As Halling reminds us, disturbance is an interval which builds resilience, but instead we are operating with static before and after notions that lead to a complete ignorance of how intervals instigate resilience. We need to take time, duration, and disturbance into further consideration, a proposal that does away with rudimentary notions of development. Current management operations and our fields alike are using the term resilience in order to simply restore our way of life and repeating known procedures in the face of extreme change. Perhaps it is time instead to restore the role of the designer. 3 principles. Let's look at a very simple, well-documented example of duration in ecology and in something we use in our field very often, intervals of risk. Long-term, large-scale environmental disturbance such as climate change, urbanization, and invasive species are chronic stress factors that permanently alter ecological conditions. Short-term, episodic disturbance such as fire, wind, logging, farming, and flooding produce dramatic but short-term effects that dissipate over time. Native ecosystems are resilient in the face of episodic disturbance, but much less so in the face of chronic stress. Emergent ecosystems can tolerate both categories of disturbances. We can comment on that slide, perhaps a little more in the panel. But all to say that we have completely ignored that human-induced climate change is a long-term disturbance that is bringing with it a great deal of change, not episodic change. Long-term disturbance. So local strategies and current institutional mandates hinged on building back stronger are being funded to reproduce known management practices and protocols and known ecologies that prioritize visual rather than functional attributes. Designers merely reproduce and replicate these known typologies, albeit a little higher and a little greener. This, you will all recognize, typifies what I mean by predictable outcomes. Here, the materials of gray infrastructure, concrete, steel, are deemed resilient to storm events, and the role of green infrastructure is not one of protection or defense, but of ecosystem services. Green is decorative and passive. Walls are reinstalled at a higher elevation and remain static and defensive, albeit concealed. The gray performs, the green distracts, and together they are called resilient infrastructure. If this system displays high stability, then it will display low resilience. What I would like to argue today, or what I'm hopefully arguing right now, is that these strategies are not only unimaginative, they are unforgivable for rehearsing the same protocols that lend a false sense of security to the public we are servicing. I argue that we need to get comfortable with low stable states and predictable behavior, rather than static outcomes that are only certain to fail. The terms restoration and resilience have evolved over the past decade to describe now both the diagnosis and the cure for climate-based coastal management practices. More precisely, they threaten to become codependent. Codependent as resilience takes on greener intentions and the role of restoration is empowered by state and federal regulation. This combined authority between resilience and restoration has stymied more experimental approaches. A false sense of security surfaces within restored communities or adjacent reconstructed seawalls, expressed by the proposition of designing with resilience. Rehearsing the same practices. So, briefly, we have seen that resilience does not represent a stable state, and I have touched briefly on the fact that not all disturbance is destructive. In the time remaining, I just want to show you why a reliance on plant form is misleading, and propose instead a consideration of plant behavior. Remember, behavior can be predictable, how materials behave, live and otherwise. The project, entitled Planting Coastal Infrastructure, emerges from a research project that began with a simple question about restoration in lowlands post-Sandy. What you see here, it's very dark, but what you see here, right there, is a stand of sassafras trees growing vigorously in a salt marsh on the southern shores of Rhode Island, right near Connecticut. After finding this stand and monitoring it for some time, we asked, this stand, by the way, this LiDAR image is 2 years post-Sandy. After finding the stand and monitoring it for some time, we asked, what if the loss of coastal lowlands can be balanced by significant gain in upland forest cover? Accepting a transitional coast means that in increasingly important ways, the questions that the natural world presents are about how to shape it and not how to preserve it. It is not difficult to imagine that elevated boardwalks, blankets, and shady groves of a forest can replace the typology of umbrellas, towels, and bikinis. When considering the scale of the issue, here is the estuary of Rhode Island, the impact of restorative practices along the urbanized coast and the potential significance of moving beyond restoration becomes evident. All ecologies require cycles of disturbance, sporadic disturbance, that result in alternative configurations, and some plants thrive through these repeated events, offering us symbols of resilience. It becomes possible to imagine that the plant is a scalar device that both creates relationships and provides the foundation for a novel form of coastal protection. In this case, using current sea level rise projections, the fringing meadows that line the estuary, wetlands and salt marshes included, will become eventually inundated by open water. That's a 20% loss of the land in Rhode Island proper, inundating much of the state, and the water's edge then extends inland and overtakes bottomland plants. The bottomland plants that were, I think it's obvious enough. As a result, upland conditions become the new coastal limits. This project then, surprisingly, we're seeing not photosynthesizing plants, but the roots. The project proposes a consideration of plant life whereby woody material becomes the primary wave attenuating agent, exploiting disturbance regimes such as wave action and inundation, effectively knocking out the tree so that it comes back more resilient. Cultivating roots or rhizomes using plant species with extended and interconnected below-grade mass, using roots as structural components, re-engages the active role of plant life, anticipating that the root zone can be measured alongside other built features, and yet has the unique capacity to adapt over time. The design we are working on proposes planting a considerable area of coastal forests along the intertidal zone, creating a biological fabric that is both adaptable and resilient to persistent saltwater inundation and sporadic surge events. accelerating the intervals of coastal variation. An assortment of disturbance-adapted woody trees and shrublands investigates accumulation on hummock-like formations. Construction occurs as a process. As species are selected for their ability to sprout through burrows, roots, and stems, their root zone thickens and their adaptive capacity to withstand disturbance multiplies. Designing a series of forests in lieu of restoring existing features forces a consideration of how the environment is valued and managed. In this case, deliberate species selection realizes the potential of plants to shape the environment, establishing a design that can be manipulated and measured alongside other construction details. These plants thrive on disturbance rhizomatically and are known for behavioral attributes and self-organizing processes. This idea harnesses the energy of disturbance of the event in order to generate ecological transitions and alternative scenarios that do not replicate past equilibrium or offer a false sense of stability. While predictions may fail and climates will change, we can begin to rely on the certainty of predictable behavior. We do not know what form the plants will take. We only know that they will come back stronger. The woody plants selected for this project simply adapt to disturbance by living longer and getting stronger as their structures below ground thicken to promote survival. These morphological features are expected to break or fall, sprouting secondary trunks. And these are species commonly found along the urbanized coasts of the North Atlantic in particular. Therefore, the project is both a construction detail and a methodology. It studies not just the isolated behavior of certain plants and their ability to sprout back, but also the contribution of individual plant behavior to the entire ecological fabric of a shifting coastal, marine, and estuarine landscape. Accepting the ongoing transitions of plant life as a design feature releases the anxiety that surrounds restorative safeguarding and changes the course of resilient measures. The project of planted infrastructure replaces the nostalgic ambitions that function with native and restorative environmentalism and proposes plants as a critical metric of coastal resilience. A tree is characteristically imagined as having one single stem rising up to a wide and dense canopy. This particular form, while culturally valuable, makes the tree susceptible to environmental disturbance. However, if a central role for disturbance is accepted as an attribute of resilient design, then the form of the tree becomes pliable or designable. Sprouting in trees is not a biological attribute that's generally considered desirable by designers who, with the curious exception of white birches, perhaps seem to favor single-stem specimens. This preference leads to an over-reliance on stock material and generic planting seedlings with great labor budgets and low diversity, denying the true potential of designing with plants. Ultimately, this also reduces the selection of plant life for a desired silhouette, a greening strategy, or a prettying up of a building. Features that ignore, of course, the root system itself. Thus, greening becomes a term that is revealed as another platitude, as it only describes the photosynthetic qualities of plants. Visible plant form is not as important as concealed plant behavior. Imagine that disturbance is a spectacle worth celebrating, and that resilience does not imply strength or offer stability. In Holling's terms, resilience is a measure of duration. Perhaps we ought to admit that modern resilience is paradoxical in the sense that the universality, its overuse and application is sanctioning the recreation of static built features rather than informing the outcomes of including novel attributes. This is evident, frankly, both at the scale of the community, the scale of the plant, and the scale of the region, in the intentions of government, legislation, and reconstruction efforts, and our reaction as designers. Perhaps the scale of the plant can become symbolic of resilience itself. So, while the intentions themselves are progressive, I argue that the design professions are not taking the notion of instability and disturbance seriously, since the meaning of resilience is quite often misunderstood, ill-defined, or not defined at all. The promise to rebuild or restore lies at the core of this misapplication, so that resilience as a term loses meaning and is reduced to a label that can help make sense of our fear of destruction. Misapplication is especially explosive along the urbanized coast, where design projects are propagating and being implemented in record numbers due to the authority of new resilience funding. A closer examination of the defining features of the term resilience can increase the motivation for a change in status quo, endorsing novel qualities and adaptable species, in order to hopefully draft a new image of adaptation. I also hope I've been provocative enough to have a lively discussion following. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rosetta. I'm going to change over our PowerPoints just a moment and introduce our next speaker. Okay, so our next speaker is Terry Schwartz, who's coming to us from Kent State University and the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative. So Terry is a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners and is the director of Kent State University's Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative. Her work at the CUDC includes neighborhood and campus planning, commercial and residential design guidelines, and ecological strategies for vacant land use. Terry launched the CUDC's Shrinking Cities Institute in 2005 in an effort to understand and address the implications of population decline and large-scale urban vacancy in Northeast Ohio. As an outgrowth of the Shrinking Cities Institute, she established Pop-Up City, a temporary use initiative for vacant and underutilized sites in Cleveland. And we'd be interested to hear about that, I'm sure, here in Buffalo as well. In 2009, Terry received the Cleveland Arts Prize for Design, and she teaches in the graduate design curriculum for the KSU College of Architecture and Environmental Design. She has a bachelor's degree in English from the IIT and a master's degree in city and regional planning from our friends at Cornell University. Just a quick note about the CUDC. It's a community service organization with a professional staff of designers committed to improving the quality of urban places through technical design assistance, research, and advocacy. It's supported by the College of Architecture and Environmental Design at Kent State University, and it offers architectural and urban design expertise in the service of urban communities, design professionals, and Ohio's public universities. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Terry Schwartz.
Thank you. I'm happy to find myself, excuse me, on a practitioners panel. I live in both the academic and practice worlds. We're the outreach division for the college. So we work around the entire Northeast Ohio region and sometimes beyond on projects with communities, nonprofit organizations, public institutions, related to a whole host of planning and urban design challenges. And so for the last couple of years, I've been working with Nick Rakovich on a climate resilience initiative for Cleveland. And even though this topic, this conversation is kind of focused on New York, I think that all of the cities around the Great Lakes, we have so much in common. So I hope that some of the things that we've been tackling are relevant here as well. So I think that like the important part of the topic I'm talking about today is really the neighborhood scale part, because sometimes we think about climate change, in that global sense of reducing carbon emissions and, glaciers and ice caps, et cetera, at that really mega macro scale. When we work in neighborhoods, sometimes it's at the really hyper-local micro scale, fuel-efficient cars and weatherizing your house and turning off the lights and this kind of thing. But in between the sort of individual actions, the micro scale, and saving the polar bears at the macro scale, there's a whole range of mid-range sort of actions that can be taken at the site, at the block, at the neighborhood scale, and that's primarily the realm where we've been trying to work. So. The work that we're doing is funded by the Kresge Foundation, and interestingly, they selected 12 cities around the country, and they're all coastal cities or in the Sun Belt. We're the only city in the Great Lakes region, so our challenges are a little bit different, and it's forced us to think about what we mean by resilience. Resilience to what? Resilience for whom? What are we talking about when we speak of this idea of climate resilience? And I think that, kind of in the biggest sense, the word means the ability of a system to take a shock and continue unchanged. But given the sort of circumstances we're experiencing in Cleveland, I'm not exactly sure that resilience always applies to us, especially on the economic and social side, because it's the system that we're in that's kind of caused a lot of the problems that we have. And so rather than, kind of sometimes in Cleveland, we talk about this sort of slow motion Katrina. It's like the city has experienced this natural disaster, but it didn't happen over a day or a week. It happened over 50 or 60 years. But so we don't necessarily want to go back, bounce back, or in the language of the Kresge Foundation, bounce forward to the place where we started. Really, instead, we're really looking at a way of understanding how the city can become something else. But on the climate side, our resiliency challenges really relate to increasing heat and the rise in mortality that parallels heat waves very precisely, at least in Northeast Ohio, based on the data that we've analyzed. Also, more frequent storms and more, kind of very violent storms, and flooding is a big problem for us in the Great Lakes. In terms of the regime change that we're looking for, if we did kind of take this hit of deindustrialization and globalization and then kind of bounce back into where we were, if we continue with business as usual, this is a regional planning process that was completed a couple of years ago for Northeast Ohio, that if we just kind of continue to do what we have been doing, by 2040 there'll be an estimated 175,000 vacant houses in the Northeast Ohio region. And when you think about $10,000 per demolition, you see that kind of continuing as we have is just not a realistic, it's not a realistic strategy. And so there are a lot of people, ourselves included, kind of looking at how the city and the region can transform into another, kind of model based on the realities of the kind of global economy, but also on the resources that we have at hand, ample fresh water, a central location. How can we kind of leverage the moment that we're in order to both stabilize the situation and also move toward regeneration? So on the population and economic side, we have a lot of work to do. On the climate resiliency side, it's actually almost a little bit more straightforward. So we find ourselves, all of us in the Great Lakes region, the stewards of this, kind of remarkable, irreplaceable natural resource. And so thinking about, kind of what the cities around the Great Lakes have in common. They're very different cities, but some of us, Cleveland, Buffalo, Toledo, maybe spring to mind, kind of have resources of, ample vacant land that has become a byproduct of the shifting population and shifting economies in our respective regions. So specifically in Cleveland, these statistics came from GLESA, which is it comes out of the University of Michigan. It's the Great Lakes Integrated Science Assessments. These numbers kind of show what we're facing, which is that annual temperatures in Cleveland are rising faster than elsewhere in the Great Lakes, and 2.4 degrees over this kind of 55-year period of time is pretty significant, especially when you look at the implications of a city that has a depleted tree canopy and a range of other kind of challenges, including an aging population and increasing social isolation, particularly of elderly, impoverished, and otherwise vulnerable populations. Also, our levels of precipitation are growing dramatically, rain and snow. We can't compete with Buffalo on the snow side, we understand that. But on the rain part and the flooding and, kind of all of the infrastructural challenges that poses, including, kind of the challenges that we continue to struggle with in terms of combined sewer overflows, these realities, the sort of historical pattern of climate change in our region, have real immediate and specific implications. So at the neighborhood scale, where we've been working, we are trying to use this resource of surplus real estate. Because we've lost well over half the population, you can see from this map, everything in red is it's a vacant lot. And so when we think about these properties and how they can be aggregated for maximum climate resiliency benefit. I mean, our idea here, our goal is to find ways to use this resource, and I'm going to continue to refer to it as that, even though in some neighborhoods vacancy is also a liability. But how can we use this resource of vacant land to help buffer people from from heat waves, from flooding, and also to help foster social cohesion, because we do know that helping people kind of plan for climate-related emergencies, includes a component of people getting to know each other well enough that they can help each other and increase survivability in the event of an extended weather event. So one more Cleveland map, and then we'll move on. But this one, a citywide inventory was conducted last year of every property in the city. Every building was given a grade from A through F, just like grades in school. The areas in blue on the map are places where there are higher percentages of A and B buildings. The red areas are the D and F zones. And so you kind of begin to see the way that the city is both dissolving and reforming around, kind of core areas of density and then large areas of abandonment. And this dynamic's going to continue to play out, for a while. We don't know for how long, but so what can we do to stabilize the parts of the city that are stable and in some cases growing, and how can we respond to some of the parts of the city that are anything but stable? What are the best strategies in terms of kind of increasing both the climate and the social resilience of these neighborhoods? So for the past decade now, we've been working with a number of organizations in the city and with the city itself on a scattered site approach to vacant land regeneration. And so there are all kinds of projects. These are just some examples of projects in the city that either perform a, kind of a social function or a stormwater management function. In some cases, are growing food and creating opportunities for people in the neighborhood to interact with each other. But so a sort of scattering of green spaces across the city can provide some benefit in terms of stormwater infiltration, some benefit in terms of restoring our very depleted tree canopy. But for us to have a real impact in terms of climate resilience, we really, I think, need to stop thinking about neighborhoods per se and focus more at the scale of the sub-watershed. So I just want to show you an example of kind of where we're trying to go with this work. This is the Dugway watershed, the brook. Well, it runs down the middle, but it's culverted, as most waterways are within the city of Cleveland. So if you take a sub-watershed like this one and begin to sort of pull it apart layer by layer, sorry if this is not very readable, but if we move upward from the bottom here, this is the sub-watershed with just the green spaces and open space within the neighborhood. And then on top of that, what we're layering here is the vacant sites, particularly the vacant sites that align with the buried waterway. And then above are the greenways that could be created to align with those underground waterways. And then the top layer are those areas of this sub-watershed that have the most potential for traditional real estate development and infill. So rather than trying to sort of scatter development throughout the neighborhood, really targeting it to a few places where there's, either existing amenities or remaining density or good transit infrastructure, a variety of criteria for, kind of these development spots within the neighborhood. But you put them all together, and then this becomes the underlay for a plan. So as we make decisions, as community development corporations in the city and private sector developers make decisions within a sub-watershed, those choices can be made with an understanding of the underlying hydrology. And when I look about, kind of at climate resilience for Cleveland, for us it really is all about hydrology and protecting the waterways that feed into the Great Lakes Basin. In other cities that aren't Great Lakes cities, there may be other priorities, but for us, climate resilience and the restoration of the tree canopy and the protection of buried waterways are really the top of the priority list. So just very briefly, a few words about soil. One of the ways that we can really understand land use in a city that's, kind of experiencing this explosive growth in vacant land within city limits is that we look at the soil types. Obviously, over the centuries of development since the city of Cleveland was formed, a lot of the soil has been disturbed, but not all of it. So understanding the underlying soils gives us at least some clues about where green infrastructure and kind of green spaces for stormwater infiltration are most likely to be successful. So these are the areas of the city that have A and B soils, just the soils that have the greatest ability for infiltration. Just has to be with the way that the glaciers moved through our region long ago. There's a lot of clay soil that doesn't absorb. It really functions a lot like pavement. The water sheets off of it, but in these areas we can often get better infiltration. In these blue areas, these are areas that at least historically had hydric soil. So these are the places that if we're going to do wetlands restoration, that some of these areas in blue might be the strongest candidates. Keeping in mind, though, that other forces determine land use, not just soil. In fact, I'm the only one who really is as interested in soil. Most of the time when people are looking at the airport, which is this area, wetlands are kind of the last thing on people's minds. This is a thriving commercial district, so the likelihood of wetland restoration there is also pretty slim. But still, we can be kind of targeted with certain efforts about finding ways to, kind of put back those ecosystem services in places where the soil will at least meet us halfway. On top of that, now we're layering over the waterways in the city, really aside from the Cuyahoga, right through the middle of the city, and the Doan Brook and the Rocky River on the edges. All the other waterways within the city are buried or culverted. And so really just understanding where they are and beginning to make choices where we're aligning the vacant sites, particularly those in the city or the county land bank, and finding ways not to build back there because it probably wasn't a great idea to build there in the first place. We have about 30,000 vacant lots in the city, a little more than half of which are in the public domain through the city or the county land bank. So we do have this opportunity for, kind of regime change at the land use level. This last overlay I included are the headwaters for all of those sub-watersheds. So those are the high spots in the watersheds. If we're going to begin restoring the city's tree canopy, it is these kind of orange squiggles across the map where, maybe those initial efforts can be first targeted. Generally speaking, the threshold we use, at least in the city, is that about 40% tree canopy is, kind of a good urban condition in terms of climate resilience. In Cleveland, we're at 19%, so we have way a long way to go. But when we put vacant land on top of this map, suddenly we have at least the beginning of a decision-making strategy about how to manage the, kind of this growing inventory of surplus publicly held property within city limits. And how it might look at the ground, on the ground. This is a neighborhood in Cleveland where, we can begin to make individual decisions at the site scale that then build to the block and the neighborhood scale. Those are the sort of three scales that we're most interested in. So we can think about a variety of green infrastructure and green space strategies that are designed specifically to the neighborhood, but that take advantage of the conditions and also the place within the watershed or the sub-watershed where each of the surplus sites where the vacant properties exist. So you combine kind of a green space strategy at the parcel and the block scale with some investments at the building scale. So for instance, home weatherization programs targeted in a way combined with tree planting and rain gardens and other green infrastructure strategies. And little by little, block by block, maybe neighborhood by neighborhood, we can build some resiliency into neighborhoods that are really very vulnerable to extreme weather. I should not have included this, it's too many words. But my point is that what Nick and I are working on right now are a series of kind of rules, principles, and parameters at each scale. So at the scale of the building, these are the actions that we can take at the scale of the site, at the scale of the block, and at the scale of the neighborhood. Ultimately, I think if we can make good decisions or help community development organizations make good decisions at the parcel and the building scale, that can leverage larger investments at the neighborhood and the citywide scale. ultimately getting us to a place where the city has greater stability and will hopefully protect people from the adverse effects of climate change. So that is all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Terry. I'm going to switch over our presentations again here and introduce our third and final speaker for this session. So our third speaker is Mike Tallou, who's coming to us from Atelier 10. Mike Tallou is a PE. He's a lead AP, Building Design and Construction, and an ASHRAE BEMP. So there's a lot of letters following his name, a lot of acronyms there. He's also an associate director at Atelier 10. He's got over 20 years of experience in energy analysis, commissioning, and building management systems, working for both national engineering firms, suppliers, and specialized consulting firms. He's worked on a variety of commercial, institutional, university, museum, healthcare, and laboratory projects. Most notably, his work includes Marina Bay Sands, the LEED Gold targeted NVIDIA headquarters, the LEED Gold targeted consortium for building energy innovation at the Navy Yard in Philadelphia, and the LEED Platinum Tata Hall on the Harvard Business School campus. Professionally, he's a longtime member of the ASHRAE 90.1 Standard Committee and a former recipient of the Consulting Specifying Engineers 40 Under 40 Award. He holds a BS in Mechanical Engineering from Rensselaer Polytech and is a registered professional engineer in the state of Massachusetts. So, okay, that's a lot. That's a lot there. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us. Please join me in welcoming Mike Tallou.
So I'm feeling like the bar's been set pretty high for me here. So, but my presentation is going to be more the engineer in me. So it's going to be a little more practical. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the trends are that we're seeing in the industry around resiliency. But I just wanted to take a moment to introduce Atelier 10. I know we're an international environmental design firm. And so we do work all over the world, and we really work very closely with design teams to promote and really push for the best sustainable and resilient solutions within the built environment. And so I was really excited to get to be invited to speak here, because Sandy was actually a big deal for us, because as you can see, you know, the bottom third of Manhattan was dark for almost a week, and our office was in that area, and so we basically couldn't work for almost 2 weeks. So it really had a big impact on us as a small firm and our culture. But we always sort of laugh because, you know, Hollywood sort of over-dramatizes what potentially could happen. You know, in the movie Day After Tomorrow from 2004 imagined Manhattan buried under feet and feet of snow, and you know, it seemed so fantastical at the time. But I think here in Buffalo in 2014 we experienced that, and so it doesn't feel so impossible anymore that this is the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with. So like the other speakers, I think it's really important that we talk about language and how do we define resilience. For our practice, resiliency is really very different from sustainability. Since the early 2000s, we've been talking about sustainability, and sustainability for us is really about mitigation. It's voluntary. You don't have to do it, but we're trying to, you know, address this issue of climate change in every way we can. Resiliency is really, it's no longer voluntary, it's a responsibility. Adaptation for climate change is critical to our survivability. And how better than to understand that a little bit and the critical nature of it than to look at, you know, just the increasing number of extreme weather events, not just in New York, but also the chart in the bottom right looks at the number of days in Perth, in Western Australia, which I'm working on a project there now. And over the last 10 years, the number of days that it's over 85 degrees has doubled. And that has huge implications in how we design buildings, how we plan for this future change in climate. And so Brendan talked a little bit about it this morning in the work he's doing and using, advanced climate files. So that's a big part of what the design community needs to be thinking about. And then when we think about resiliency, there's lots of different components of resiliency. And so today I picked out 4 topics that I'm going to talk about. They really focus specifically on buildings as opposed to sort of more regional or sort of more broad global resiliency sort of discussions. And I'm going to start with some research we did after Sandy in collaboration with the Urban Green Council in New York on a publication called Baby, It's Cold Inside. And it deals with the thermal envelope. We talked a lot about this morning, so I'll maybe not go over a lot of the things we discussed. But to start, one of the big conclusions that came out of the New York City Resiliency Task Force after Sandy was that buildings must be able to provide essential safety without any power at all. And so this is this idea of passive survivability that was discussed earlier. And really it's important to understand this idea of how we as humans experience the environment around us. And we know that if the temperature is too low, below 50 degrees, that's dangerous for us as human beings. Our systems shut down. Likewise, if the temperatures are too high, we experience the same sort of systemic problems. And so really it's critical that we maintain environments in this range of 65 to 85 degrees within our indoor environments, and being able to sustain those over a long period of time. So in the event of a blackout, we need to be able to have indoor environments that can sustain us for 2, 3, 4 days or more. So we did this research to look at 6 different residential typologies, mostly in the New York City urban area, although we did do a single family home. And we looked at comparing typical building envelopes versus what would be considered a high performance building envelope. And we were trying to investigate the duration of passive survivability. And what we concluded was that high performance buildings could significantly extend the duration of safely being indoors during one of these extreme events from 1 to 1.5 days to 7 days. And so it really drives sort of the policy thinking that goes into energy standards and other policies that New York City was thinking about. And so, the conclusion was, focusing on infiltration and windows and insulation in the buildings really is critical, and not so much because it saves us money on our energy costs, because it improves the survivability and resilience of our buildings. But it's not just occupants anymore. So the project I mentioned in Perth, it's a cultural museum, and they have resiliency requirements. So they are interested in their galleries being able to have the same type of temperature resiliency, not for people, but for the artifacts. They want to be able to shut down the museum in the event of an emergency and know that artifacts are going to be safe. So we're having to design for the same types of resiliency effects to show that a gallery space can be quickly shut down and can maintain a very tight temperature range over a long period of time without any sort of mechanical conditioning. So the second topic I wanted to talk about is energy. When we think about energy efficiency from a resiliency or an adaptive perspective, it's very different than from a sustainability or mitigation perspective. It's no longer about cost. It's about how much fuel do I have to have on site to get through an emergency event? Can I run more of my building during that emergency event, or am I really just very limited in what I can operate? And so that, and can I have smaller emergency systems? And so these things all sort of go, it's a different way of thinking about the design of a building. But fundamentally, the process that you go through to achieve those goals of resiliency from an energy perspective are the same, it's the same process that we use for sustainability. You start with passive design strategies, and you work through and focus on broad system-level interventions last. And I think the thing, though, that is a little different is when we get down to the end, where we have on-site renewable generation and future renewable production. That's where we're starting to see some differences in the way project teams and clients are thinking about the solution. And so what I want to talk a little bit about microgrids, because that's something that we're seeing a lot more interest in. We're doing a number of projects where we're focusing on how to integrate microgrids into the work. And so just as a reference, so a typical building is going to be connected to the grid. If it has renewable energy, typically we use a net metering arrangement where the generated electricity gets fed back into the grid and it powers the building. And the problem with this arrangement is that if the grid goes down, typically you're not able to use this power that you're generating on site because the utility grids basically cut it off and they don't want power backfed into the grid. So you're stuck, unable to use this electricity that you're able to generate. And so the idea of a microgrid, and more importantly a DC microgrid, direct current microgrid, allows you the ability to continue to use power that you generate on site even when your connection to the regional electric grid goes down. And sort of I would call it the current way of thinking about this is, there's limited uses if you're considering a DC microgrid. You could maybe do some site lighting. Maybe you could run some selective equipment within your building. So it's, unfortunately, there's not a lot of it's a tough sell, but the projects we are seeing it on are realizing it because they can gain the efficiency of not having to generate DC power, convert it back to AC, and realize a 5 to 10% efficiency loss in those conversion processes. But what we are starting to explore with clients is how to reach the full potential of a DC microgrid, which includes battery storage. Out in California, where there's a lot of tech industry, they use a lot of computers. Computers are inherently use DC power. And so we're exploring with some clients out there the notion of creating this DC microgrid that powers their complete technology infrastructure within a building so that they're no longer reliant on AC power. So any on-site generation of power that they're doing with photovoltaics or wind directly powers their infrastructure and to them is a very resilient solution because they're no longer dependent on the grid for their core functions. It also allows us to introduce battery storage. It allows us to think about using DC lighting. And the really interesting thing that at Greenbuild, there was a presentation on DC microgrids, and it turns out that the United States has a long history of DC microgrids. Back in the early 20th century, much of the western and midwestern parts of the US that didn't have access to the new AC power transmission lines that were along the coasts actually functioned on small DC microgrids. And there was actually a very robust industry of products that you could buy that used DC power. And it was only after the Depression, when we decided to electrify the entire United States and create these AC grids that connected the entire country, that these DC microgrids that were powering these small communities disappeared. So it really feels like it's going back to what we knew really well 100 years ago. So just in summary, some of the benefits of DC microgrids are increased control, reduced transmission losses, and it just sort of supports a building level resiliency strategy because it gives you that flexibility to suffer through an emergency event. And then it's not hocus pocus. Out in California, microgrids are being developed at a wide scale from as small as 3 megawatts up to 42 megawatts, and I know they're also working on ones that are even larger. So it's not just a great idea. This is actually being implemented, and these strategies are becoming part of what our industry is doing. So the next most important, another very important part of resiliency at the building level is water. And I'm just going to walk through a quick case study of a project that we're doing. This is out in San Francisco, right on San Francisco Bay, which faces a lot of the same challenges that the coastal eastern United States faces in terms of storm surge. But certainly access to clean, potable water is extremely important. And so as part of the process we work through with helping teams understand the strategies that make the most sense, we start with a water balance to understand what water is available. Where do we need water? Do we have a surplus? Do we have a deficit? And then we can start to lay out different strategies of how to use water. And if you look here on the left, the first two strategies sort of represent the code minimum that is expected for a project, which really is collecting stormwater and having the ability to reuse it as gray water for sewage conveyance or irrigation as a way to reduce just stormwater runoff volumes. But what we're starting to find, and this is certainly the case out on the West Coast, but it's also the case here on a couple projects on the East Coast, it's really expensive to do that. There's a lot of piping infrastructure that has to be put in place. There's a huge amount of storage that's required. And what we're finding is that when you have projects that are developer-led, they're actually ending up at Blackwater solutions and proposing as the least cost solution for them to put an on-site Blackwater plant that can treat sewage conveyance locally and then reuse it as gray water within the building. And this significantly reduces the infrastructure that they need to integrate into a building in terms of piping, and in the case of this project, connecting, piping that collects water from all the buildings and then redistributes it out. So for those of you that don't know, so my question is on-site Blackwater treatment the new normal? I think, certainly from my perspective, the last 10 years, you bring up that and, people sort of nod and go, great idea, way too expensive. But the reality is it's not anymore. So for those of you that don't know, Blackwater treatment is taking sewage, treating it on site so that it can be to different levels, so that it can be used for irrigation or clothes washing or sewage conveyance, so that you're not using potable water for that. And from a resiliency perspective, this significantly reduces the amount of potable water storage that you need to have for things like cooking and hand washing and showering. So that extends the ability of a building to, ride out an extreme weather event. And then going even a step further, we're starting to look at scaling down the biogas, conversion of biogas to electricity that happens at sort of the municipal wastewater scale. Can it be scaled down to the building scale? Can it be scaled down to a development scale as another potential solution to make this on-site wastewater treatment essentially carbon neutral? So that's interesting. How am I doing? And then I had one last thing that I wanted to share with anyone. And since we're talking about resiliency, this is something that not a lot of people know about. But there's actually a national consensus resiliency standard. It was developed by a group called Capital Markets in Washington, D.C., as well as in collaboration with Perkins and Will out of their Minnesota offices. And they developed it as a way to be used as an underwriting standard for green financing. And so I think it's important for my talk because, you know, I talk about DC microgrids and Blackwater, and everyone always goes, well, how are you going to pay for it? Well, right now, the green bond market is very advantageous. People are looking to put money into green projects. And so the development of this standard is a great way for projects to be able to document their resiliency in order to attract green funding. And so I'll just quickly go through, you know, how it's organized. It builds on what we know. So it builds on sort of the LEAD framework of having strategies and building different combinations of strategies to achieve different levels of resiliency. So it scales really well to a single building project all the way up to campuses, organizations. So it fits into how our industry already thinks about these types of solutions. It pulls into it from a broad range of research and thinking around resiliency. It's very comprehensive. And it organizes into categories that are a little different than maybe you'd think of from LEAD. They're categories that focus on resiliency. So how broad an approach are you taking? You know, hazard preparedness, adaptation and mitigation, community, productivity and health, energy and water, materials and artifacts, and then creativity. And as I mentioned, it's an underwriting standard for the green bond market right now. We use this on a competition for a new 77-story building that is being proposed in downtown Boston. And it allowed us to bring to the table like over $400 million in green bond financing that we were able to get secured in under a week. So in terms of the value that thinking about resiliency in this way, it really can help solve the money problem. And then finally, this is available to everyone. You can go to the c3livingdesign.org website and find the RELY standard. They've got the action list and other information about how to put a project together, the credit catalog that sort of describes how to use it. So I think that's all I've got. So.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and thank you to all three of the speakers. If I can invite you to come up and join us at the panel table here, I'd like to shift to engage the rest of the folks in the room as well, and to have a bit of a discussion on some of the work and some of the thoughts that were just put there in front of us. And let me. Ask you to talk a good bit more. So to kick things off, I had some questions to pull us together as well, and I'd like to open it up to the room. And you'll see that Harley and Krista are standing by with microphones. We do need you to ask questions into the microphones if you have them. But I think there's a big range of work that we saw presented, and again, a range in terms of scale, a range in terms of kind of orientation to various kinds of clients through the project. But I'm curious to ask for each of your reflections on the nature of some of the new methodologies and new relationships that emerge from the kinds of work that you're doing in response to this new challenge. So we heard in the first part of today, and each of you talked to some extent in your presentations about the response to the changing climate in each of the scales at which you're working. And this, in some cases, has yielded new methodologies, new ways of thinking, and potentially new relationships, in part because of this challenge of scale, and that the scale of regulations and the scale of code may be different from the scale of the site and the scale at which your client is asking you to work. But those are both almost guaranteed to be different from the scale of impact that we're able to see and that we see from some things like climate assessments. So how do you reconcile these kind of these shifts in scales, and how does that translate into new methodologies or new collaborative relationships when you work with those who represent other scales or who work in different professional orientations that are bringing some of the same questions to the table? And I'd just like to get some of your reflections on those questions of scale and relationship and methodology.
It's a really hard question.
That is.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry, I started off with the tough one.
I can take a stab at it.
You want to go first? Okay.
I mean, go ahead.
Scale's always hard. I mean, I do work nationally at like a standard level, and so, you know, I see that scale, you know, that work really sort of trickles down, and I see it trickle down. It's not the most exciting level because you're dealing with like nuts and bolts and spending hours focusing on how do I rewrite a single sentence so that everyone's happy with it. But I think it's better, it's easier for me to answer the relationship piece. Because what we experience in our work is that, you know, resiliency has really galvanized a lot of communities and really gotten them to think critically about what's important to them. And so when we used to, you know, 10 years ago and looking at sustainability, it was always difficult because, you know, not everyone was on board with sort of driving ahead with sustainability. But when I think now on projects, you know, resiliency and this idea of everyone's kind of on board with it, from design teams to contractors to developers. And so the conversations are very different. It's not, we can't do something, it's how do we do it the best way that's the most cost-effective way that meets these goals. And so, you know, when it was the discussion was about sustainability, that was always very hard. And the conversations would break down. But now there's this much greater alignment between all the different players on a project team. And so it's really about investigating the different options so that as the team can really focus on how to pick the right one. And I think that, you know, is exemplified in what we're seeing around, or what I'm seeing anyway, in developers being eager to put Blackwater systems onto their projects, because for them, you know they have to do something, but that's the least cost option for them. And so they're developing strategies and their construction practices around adopting that into the way they work. And so I guess that's sort of what I'm seeing the difference, that's the shift in the last few years, is that resiliency is sort of bringing people together in communities a little bit better around these sort of common goals.
It's a hard question, I think, in part.
Give it a shot.
I just, real quickly, that the challenge that we face over and over again is that the scale of our response and the scale of the problem are in really two different places. That we've been involved in about 200 parcel level projects, but we have 30,000 sites that ultimately are going to need to be touched in one way or another. And I don't know exactly how to get from the scale of pilot project to the scale of citywide and regional impact. I don't know without massive funding, and I don't know where that funding is coming from. On the collaborative side, I mean, the one thing that it seems like that people professionally are moving away from interdisciplinary toward more transdisciplinary practices, if you will. I mean, I think actually, Rosetta, it was the comment that you made that gray performs and green distracts. I think that's because we have we have either landscape architects working in an interdisciplinary way with engineers, but in some ways, I think that, you know, it's more than just working with people of a different discipline. You have to actually get into the skin of somebody who does something really different from you. I'm always finding myself in places where I don't exactly belong, but sometimes those are the most productive places.
I very much agree. Well, to the question of scale more broadly, we have to get better at working telescopically, and that's being able to work through various scales at the same time and not get stuck at one scale, but see how things come in and out of focus depending on which scale you're in. Because the issues are systemic, and we can't have singular solutions to systemic issues any longer. This is very clear from everyone's presentation. So I think we need more, just more fluidity with scale as designers, as opposed to being more deterministic about scale, if you will. I'm coming from 12 years of practice, but I'm in academia now. And one of the reasons for that, which I think is implicit in how I was speaking, is we need to come out in front of some of these issues also. We're both at different sides of the battle, so to speak, but we need both. Because when I work with the Army Corps, I'm working with their research unit. I can't work with district offices. District offices are they're operating. They're following orders. It has to be much further out in that planning to look ahead at what's essentially considered preemptive now. So, it's not about being reactive, it's about being preemptive. And that right away also sort of changes the scale. It also changes the nature of how you're working. To the question of funding, it's very unfortunate that in this country, funding streams come post-disaster. It's very, very difficult to get funding for any preemptive work. So you have to stay in research, even though we can see the benefits of coming out in front of some of the issues and still providing fantastic public space and wonderful amenities and, great standards. And we can do all of that, if and when, as well as endure. So, there are so many levels of policy and limitations, and I think asking the right questions and being able to be telescopic through each of those is really important. I just want to see designers doing more of it. Personally, if maybe I'm speaking too long, but just being reactive as a designer is taking away, frankly, our profession. Sorry to be really blunt, but in a way, if all we do is react to numbers that scientists give us, or datums that we have to follow, or quantities and metrics, then we are reactive as a profession. And we used to be very much out ahead of a lot of issues as a field, as the entire landscape architects, planners, designers, And I think a lot of the work you're doing is trying to get there, to try to be one step out from, but we all need to do it.
I think there's some questions coming from the audience too. If you will raise your hand so that the microphones can move to you. And while they're doing that, I want to kind of pick up on a couple of threads that were mentioned there that may relate to some of the questions from the audience too. And that is the distinction between the kind of relationships that you're seeing in work now with work under the kind of sustainability paradigm. And one of the things that Rosetta was we were chatting before the conference, and mentioned a conference recently in Minnesota that was on resilience and was titled "The Death of Sustainability." So the question to the group is the kind of looking for those frictions. Where are the frictions between sustainability and resilience? Is this paradigm, is this the end of sustainability? You each kind of mentioned some distinctions between, green conceals the kind of infrastructure that's going on rather than a kind of resilient structure that's actually making some systemic change. Mike, you mentioned that sustainability was hard to sell and resilience is easy to sell. It's one distinction. And I think, Terry, you alluded to the fact that the Cleveland perhaps is not in a there isn't, the trajectory that Cleveland is on is not one to be sustained. And so the question really is resilient to what, and what are we going back to or leaning forward toward? So is this the end of sustainability? Have we moved beyond that to another kind of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary conversation, or is this a nuanced version of it?
No, I would say no, it's not the death of sustainability. I would say it's a complementary way of thinking about sustainability that, because a lot of sustainability and decision-making was all cost-based. And now when we think about resiliency, it's really, the cost is now human cost. It's, if we don't do a better job of having our buildings adapt, more people die when there's a really bad storm. So I think it's complementary in many ways, and it builds on the principles of sustainability, but it brings it changes sort of how we think about the benefits and the value of building a better built environment. So it's not just about mitigating the effects of climate change, it's saving our skin. So, they're not separate.
But better is such a tricky word. And so it depends like what your skin is made of, if you're saving your skin. So I mean, we've gotten very used to being extremely comfortable and more rich and with more and more stuff and more isolated from the environment in many ways. And so the idea of passivity is really incredible in your work, and how we, adapt to, environments that are changing, like the urban environment that you exemplify, which is not densifying as modernism promised. It's de-densifying, and then what? And so we have to, I think the concept of adaptability that's embedded in resilience is the most powerful one. We have to be more adaptable to change, and we've thus far tried to keep change far from our bodies, far from ourselves, far from harm. And sometimes change can create stronger outcomes, different alternatives, and more learning. And that's adaptability, I think. I just don't think we can build our way out of the problem any longer. I think both of your projects are also very much about de-engineering.
Okay, so we have a question over here in the third row.
Well, my question really relates to the one you just asked, but I had a different take. When I was listening to Mike say that sustainability was a hard sell and resilience wasn't, it seemed to me that was partly because resilience is more selfish, for lack of a better word. That it's much more obvious that you get the primary benefit from doing the resilient things, whereas with sustainability, a large part of what the benefit is goes to other people as well as yourself, possibly. And maybe that's an issue of scale, that resilience is easier to imagine on a smaller scale, and sustainability inherently seems larger challenge. So I'm just wondering if you have any further thoughts about the rhetoric and the underlying motivations behind the kinds of work that you do. Why do people come to you and ask you to do this? And what kind of rhetorics are most effective in encouraging more people to want to do the kinds of things that you all do?
I think that was.
I know, it's for me. It's hard. It's always this balance between, the cost of building a building and what its benefit is going to be. And so I think for us, a lot of our clients tend to be forward-thinking, and so they want to do more than the minimum that they have to do. So they're looking for innovative ways to do more than just build the simple, build that wall that keeps the storm surge out. You know, they're looking for that solution that is more flexible, is more adaptable. And so when I was listening to you talk, I'm like, oh, God. I'm like the opposite in bringing sort of forward engineering solutions to the problem. But I mean, in our work, we try to integrate not just engineering solutions, but also ones that, you know, minimize density, create more open space, you know, really reflect on the local environment and culture. So I think that's a lot of what our clients are looking for from us, are the kinds of solutions that aren't just build a wall and make it, you know, plant grass on it so it looks green. From a scale perspective, that's always hard. We did a little bit of research a couple years ago with New York City, or with Urban Green, to try and, it was called the Worldwide Lessons, is what we named it. And we tried to look at codes and policies in sort of some peer cities around the world to New York, to try and understand a little bit more, you know, how is what New York City doing stack up against what was happening in Sydney and London and Singapore and Frankfurt and San Francisco. And it was really hard, because what we found is that all these cities are doing all the same very similar things, and there were these just nuanced, the differences we were finding were really cultural, not systemic. And so I think they were expecting that there were just going to be these easy answers. Oh, we just need to do this, this, and this. And we didn't find that. But I think what we did learn is that from a scale perspective, at a large scale, the places that were more successful were the ones that had a broad overarching policy, and in this case, climate policy. And that policy drove local standards and codes. And then the third piece of it was a really strong education component. And I think one of the big key things was that over in Europe, what they've done as part of their climate initiative is that they've helped each country develop an education roadmap around the skills that the workforce has to actually implement and make improvements, and so that each country has now focused on educating their workforce so that they have the right workforce to implement these things. And so from a scale perspective, I think that's something where we maybe haven't explored as much here in the United States, is how do we sort of broadly create a workforce that understands these issues and can construct and build buildings that are better buildings.
But I think if I could just add real briefly that it also takes, you know, kind of a nuanced understanding of vulnerability, really, because, I mean, if we put kind of resilience in a category of advanced through self-interest, it still leaves a lot of people in harm's way. Because, at least in the communities where I work, when bad things happen, you know, those of us with a lot of stuff and money put our stuff in our car and get out of harm's way. But it leaves a lot of people who, you know, don't have the tools to be able to respond to the crisis. And so really understanding how it has to get beyond sort of a vested self-interest to really understanding kind of where the most vulnerable populations are, what makes them vulnerable, and then how we address that at a variety of scales, I think is really critical, because climate-related deaths don't look like gun-related deaths, I guess is all I'm saying. And so people don't sort of understand the risk, or aren't focused on that risk, because, you know, in Cleveland, when we have weather over 85 degrees for more than a couple of days, the number of cardiovascular deaths, heart attacks, kind of jumps, and I mean to a staggering degree. But people don't kind of go, oh, that's the cause and effect isn't there. So really understanding kind of the social components behind it are really critical when you're in an economically diverse place.
It also speaks to timescales. Again, it's the kind of risk that Terry's describing there's slow risk and fast risk, you know, and we fund fast risk and fast recovery in this country. That's what we do. Sorry to be super general about it. So when things creep in, you know, it's less visible, and you can't operate as easily as a designer, or even in the community. So, I mean, an example that occurs to me is I work in Miami Beach right now, and, you know, at the building scale, you can build your way out of it if you have money. I mean, these are like vertical cruise ships. I mean, they are totally wind resistant. They have enough food and staff, frankly, to subsist for weeks if there was a devastation. But it's the low rise working, you know, it's low rise, it's not low class, but it's middle class. It's still Miami Beach. But they're one-story bungalows that make up most of the middle of Miami Beach. And they can't get out. Literally one causeway also. So the evacuation route is awful. And so, you know, with certain funding mechanisms, you're able to be resilient or build your way out of the issue, Blackwater or not. You're self-sufficient in each of these towers. And the community itself suffers. There's not a lot of resilience at that level. Meaning, when I say resilience in that case, I mean being able to lean on one another, know where to go, figure out how to get fresh water, and get out of harm's way, because it's happening more slowly there. The water's rising slowly in Miami. There hasn't been a big storm in a long time. We'll see if it happens quickly. When it happens quickly, then we'll see a lot of transformation. And people are suffering daily.
Okay, great question. If you'll permit me to keep you in the room a little bit longer, let's take one more question before we go to the break. Okay. Oh. Linda?
We should take a student question.
Thank you. All three of you, I think, one more besides me?
Yeah, we'll do one more after you, Linda. Sorry.
Great,
we've got-
okay.
we've got one or two.
I thought it was just fascinating, all three of you, because each of you in your own way sort of have transformed a paradigm, the one that we've been operating under. I always think of Edmund Carpenter, who said, we don't know who discovered water, but we can be sure it wasn't a fish. And I think that the professional realms that we live in and the groups that we live in all the time have certain responses to things. And climate change is unlike everything else. It's a wicked problem. It touches every sphere unequally, as you all were just talking about. And not only that, it's the adaptation is that I'm hoping everybody in this room works towards actually getting us a climate policy right now. Today is actually the day that the Paris Agreement has gone into effect. We know it's not enough, but it's a significant thing. So we have to stop it while we're working on adaptation and stuff. But I was curious as to whether or not the kinds of issues that you're raising up, are you having resistance within professional communities that you're operating under to actually really rethink the standards of practice and the regulations that we tend to be operating in right now?
I have found collaboration. I mean, when you meet someone who isn't interested or doesn't think it has value, you move on to another interested party. I mean, sorry to be blunt, but I mean, you know, at a certain level, it is scale. I mean, again, at the district office in Rhode Island, there wasn't much interest in the issue. Then you get statewide, go to the CRMC, they start to have interest because they're actually thinking about retreat, about how to incentivize people to move away from the coast, which brought me to the headquarters, to HQ, where I was able to be in a room and say, okay, but living shorelines, you're not testing the subgrade for the plant matter. You're testing the subgrade for structure, and it's just insufficient. And it was a kind of, and that just has created a series of very interesting conversations. So I have been met with a lot of interest and curiosity, frankly. I think it hasn't trickled down, but again, that's because, people still need, daily life still has to operate, and we still need to build, and the practices of current policy and zoning, you have to follow them. You can't be fighting every day. But there are, again, different scales. You can have research projects where you're working on something that's further out while you're operating on the ground and changing minds. So I've had a relatively positive, nobody wants to hear about invasive species ever. That's my only resistance, I would say. And I understand, it's just that we're talking about moving people from their homes, we're talking about changing climates, we're talking about elevated sea level rise, but everyone wants the plants to stay the same. And I think that's problematic. So they're changing too. So, that's between conservationists and the plant, and I have nothing to do with it, really.
From my perspective, I mean, it's, the work we do, unfortunately, is self-selected for, clients that are somewhat aspirational. So, but I think there is still a lot of resistance in the industry in terms of changing how we as engineers and designer professionals actually practice our work. I mean, I'm very fortunate to get to work with design professionals that are very open-minded and very, looking to do the best they can. I know there's a lot out there that just want to do the minimum that they can get away with. So I think that's, that resistance is best chipped away with better policy, better codes. I mean, I think, one good example is, New York State just adopted a new energy code. And one of the things that they did that I thought was really interesting is they adopted more stringent envelope requirements for buildings than they had to. And I have no doubt that that came out of the recognition that from a resiliency perspective, there's benefit there to doing that. And that's going to change the industry. Another good example is in New York City, they've actually started enforcing the energy code, which is, in terms of resistance, that's what is causing the most concern for our architecture clients. They've never had someone tell them they can't do something before, and it's starting to happen, and they're changing the way they work. They're more aware of the envelope they're designing. They realize that they can't just pick products that aren't certified because someone's going to check, and they won't get their CO if, they don't meet certain criteria. So, I think there are ways to deal with resistance, and we're slowly sort of moving in that direction, but it is very slow in a lot of places.
Add that our clients are also mostly self-selected, but at the other end of the spectrum, as a little community design center, we're the designers of last resort for a lot of communities, and I don't know that we experience kind of resistance to the idea, but sort of on the hierarchy of needs sometimes, to the point about timescales. If climate change is a problem that's slowly emerging and may happen, there are more immediate concerns that people have. But really the only resistance that, kind of we've been seeing a lot at the municipal level is the idea that resilience is sort of the last chapter in the plan. You know what I mean? So sustainability used to be like this too, that it's like something that after you think about all the other things, you also include this chapter on this topic, rather than thinking about the ways that we can build resiliency into all aspects of operations, from building code to zoning code to even the way that, kind of our police consent decree is going to unfold. Are there ways that can, kind of help safety services be more responsive to the real needs of communities? And I think we're away from seeing, kind of more integrated approaches. But for now, at least we're being able to get headway on that one chapter in the plan, and that maybe it becomes more kind of holistic as we progress.
Okay, great question. We're going to take one more. Brad, this is your shot, and then we'll take our break.
All right, so quickly, thank you guys again for being here. We obviously really appreciate it. And from a student perspective, I think we're all always hungry for knowledge and hungry for more, especially today, because you guys are obviously touching on things that we're all very deeply invested in. And I was wondering if in closing, each of you could maybe give either a firm or a project, or maybe somebody that you guys look to in your research, you guys really kind of look to for influence, and who has really kind of helped your research or your practice in a big way, whether it be past, contemporary, or even obviously in the future, as we talk about being on the cusp of something much greater than us.
Great question. Thank you. Another tough one.
I'll go first. I have an answer. So, the group right now that I'm most excited to go and spend time with every year is Atelier 10 is an industry partner with the Center for the Built Environment out in Berkeley. And that's their building performance group. And so they have twice a year they have a conference where their researchers present their work in progress. And for me, it's what I'm most interested in, which are things, passive design, especially passive heating and cooling within buildings, so radiant heating and cooling, as well as thermal comfort. They do a lot of work. They're doing a lot of research right now on wearable devices to improve occupant thermal comfort within a building. So for example, they're building this prototype insoles for your shoe that have special little pressure points that pinpoint spots on your foot that would, help try and heat a spot on your foot that then would give you a greater sense of thermal comfort within a cold space. As just one example, they've developed a prototype chair that has sort of heating and cooling built into it as a way to try and allow for more passive buildings with sort of a broader temperature range, but then sort of this micro conditioning for each occupant. So that's the group I would say that I'm most inspired by right now, that I look to for sort of my regenerative thinking.
So you guys have Nick, right? I mean, when we Nick actually in his heart is a Clevelander, and so when we run into kind of challenges, and a lot of the work we've been doing at neighborhood scale, climate resilience really came at the initiative of kind of Nick prodding me to apply for this Kresge grant. But I think one other kind of partner, maybe not so much partner as inspiration, a couple of years ago we had Susanna Drake from D-Land Studio do a workshop with our students, and what really was striking to me about her work, and I think it's becoming more common in practice now, is for landscape architecture firms or urban design firms to do both client-driven projects, but also have a research division. And so within her studio, D-Land Studio, she has a nonprofit division that pursues grants from, kind of national and regional funders. And I think as young practitioners, I always encourage my own students to kind of think this way, that, you don't have to choose between practice and research. You can find ways to merge the two. In fact, I think it really is going to be really the only way to function, kind of in the design fields in the future.
And so I love the plug for landscape architecture there. Suzanne is a good colleague. But it's true that landscape architecture is a very research-driven field. It doesn't even have to be next to each other. It's just part of, every good project starts with research, and research can become its own entity, or it can, anyways, it doesn't matter. So the answer to the question, I guess I'll go historical, because, I was trying to, decide I could give you lists. I mean, there's so much inspiration out there, and people are doing great work. But Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted, who, when he saw far enough ahead when New York was developing the way it was, he wasn't waiting for a commission to come across his table, and he wasn't waiting for a buzzword like sustainability or resilience. He came out in front of it, and he understood that where density was going to go. It's to your dean's comment of the hockey puck, of where it's going, and not just following it, but knowing where it's going. And I think that if your design can be that far ahead in terms of its theory and practice and method, then you're always doing good work. And it won't have to be labeled during the times. You just label it for funding streams, and you're doing good work. Look at Olmsted. Look at all of what he did. He didn't even have a field he was operating in. He came up with the term landscape architect to impress his father so he could get more funding from the UK when he was in America. So, no, I mean, quite literally, I think he has masterminded American cities and Canadian cities, not to mention, improving some European precedents, but just think of some of his work, and I think it's pretty inspirational.
Yeah, I like that we get to close with some thoughts of Olmsted, who we know here in Buffalo as well. So great conversation, good questions, keep them coming. The panelists will be available during the break. We'll reconvene at 4. Please sign up for the CEUs if you need them, and we'll get together for the keynote speaker at the end. So please join me in thanking the panelists one more time for their contribution.